Journey is funded by a grant from the National Education Association, the NEA, preparing America's students for the future. Texaco, a world of energy. And the Boeing Company, saluting these extraordinary pioneers.
Internal, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence start. Engines armed. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All engines running.
When I decided to be an astronaut, the first decision that I made was what I call a head decision. I saw the astronauts traveling into space, landing on the moon, and I said, that looks like fun. That's what I want to do.
When I first went to NASA, we had about 165 aircraft, 65 astronauts, and about the same number of pilots and trainers that trained the astronauts.
It was the summer of 1941, and the United States Army Air Corps, responding to presidential pressure, opened its ranks to Negroes in military aviation. It formed 4 fighter squadrons, exclusively made up of Negro men.
One of the most important things that, or was the impetus for black people flying airplanes was Eleanor Roosevelt. When she flew with Chief, we call him Chief Anderson, Charles Alfred Anderson, who was basically the head instructor there at Tuskegee when the Tuskegee experiment was taking place. When she flew with Chief Anderson, I guess the world knew that black people could fly airplanes because Chief Anderson was one of the early pioneers in black aviation, or Negro aviation as it was called then. But it was through the efforts of our predecessors that allowed us to not only fly and fight for this country, but to also get into the commercial world.
Later, an inaugural exercise was held marking the beginning of military pilot training on the campus of Tuskegee Institute. They became known as the Tuskegee Airmen.
Those gentlemen proved to the world that black people could fly airplanes. Of course, we knew it years ago when the French had black pilots even before the United States did. And of course, there were several black individuals that flew for the French during World War I and II.
But this was only the beginning for Negroes in aviation. Ultimately, within the next 26 years, the Tuskegee Airmen would not only lead the United States Air Force toward inclusion of blacks in aviation, but to the inclusion of blacks in the U.S. space program.
Here are the results of the successful completion of the Tuskegee experiment, when the handful of gentlemen, I guess a little over 900 who were commissioned and received their wings through the Tuskegee program, when they made their name in history, that opened the door for the rest of us. You might say I'm the next generation directly behind the Tuskegee Airmen.
In 1967, in what would later be known as the Civil Rights era, the U.S. Air Force named 32-year-old Major Robert Lawrence Jr. to its manned orbiting laboratory program.
Well, I'm very happy that they named Major Lawrence the first black astronaut, because he was. Even though he did not orbit the Earth, he had suborbital flight, and he was the first astronaut that was in training for us, that is the United States government.
Unfortunately, about 6 months after being selected for this great honor, he was killed in a training accident. But we all of us who were involved in the space program, remember that, and remember his sacrifice that paved the way for us all.
Tragically, Major Lawrence was killed in the crash of an F-104 fighter plane during a training exercise, 6 months after being named to the Air Force program. Now recognized as the first black astronaut, Lawrence would have been America's only black astronaut until NASA chose 3 more African-American astronauts in 1978. Major Frederick Gregory, a shuttle commander. Major Guy Bluford Jr. and Dr. Ronald McNair, both mission specialists.
As a young man looking into the space program, and as I had mentioned, following the original guys into space, being an African-American kid, or a colored kid at the time, at that time, that's what they called us. When I looked at the program, there weren't any African-Americans that were out front. And it wasn't until a few years later, after we had come from the moon and began to get involved in the shuttle program, that a young man by the name of Guy Bluford show up.
Guy Bluford and I flew combat together in Vietnam. Guy is much younger than I, and so is Fred. But the fact remains that they all had a military background and received their wings, pilot training wings, in the United States Air Force.
Major Guy Bluford would become the first black American astronaut to fly in space.
Once we got on orbit, the view from space was just spectacular, and this is just an indication of that just from the cockpit. One of the objectives of our mission was to deploy the INSAT satellite, and this is the cockpit arrangement associated with deploying a satellite. In this particular view, Dan is actually operating the 16-millimeter camera, panning the cockpit. You can see Dick over there on the left. He's sort of supervising the operation. There's Dale. He's going to be handling the cameras and the switches. And I'm working from the commander's seat up front, sending out commands through keyboard and talking to the PAM and a satellite through CRT display.
Fred Gregory, years ago, was one of my students in F4. I checked him out in the F4. And of course, as you know, he was the first, or the most notarized astronaut that we had. There were others prior to him, but he, as a pilot, made history.
Major Frederick Gregory would become the first black American astronaut to command a shuttle flight.
We're kind of floating up onto the flight deck. We're preparing for deorbit, and we've put in the rear seats, all of the wires and all the hoses. And I'm over here in the commander's seat getting ready for some of the activities that will occur the next day, and it includes a lot of inputs onto the through the keyboard onto the computer, and obviously I must like it because I gave you a thumbs up on it. This was our Thanksgiving dinner, and we hope we enjoyed it at about the same time you did. It's always, the story said it's always great to be in space in Thanksgiving, but he's always happy to be in space all the time.
This is the only time we got to sit down together.
By 1980, another black astronaut, Major Charles Bolden, was selected as an astronaut candidate.
Here you see our commander keeping fit for the entry, and I'm really glad he did that, because he did an excellent job. Charlie was doing a DSO for 30 minutes every day running, which he sometimes enjoyed, but maybe not.
Everybody has something that they call their favorite when you go fly, and mine is lightning, because I always tell everybody that, to me, it's like an orchestra playing, and it seems like the lightning plays off each strike. You know, you'll see one and it just ripples all across the face of the earth. It's a beautiful spectacle. You can actually see the earth limb in the upper left-hand corner there, and the big city, or the bright spot you see that's steady there, is the city of Buenos Aires. We carried 2 IMAX cameras. One was the in-cabin camera that you see Kathy and me trying to get reloaded here. The other was the IMAX cargo bay camera, which we have not seen any of the film yet, but hopefully we'll see in another week or 2.
Fred Gregory was also involved in the program early on. In fact, he was selected along with Guy and also Ron McNair. So they were the 3 people that were the first African Americans selected for the NASA astronaut program. And subsequently, they all went and flew.
We got into the West Star deployment on the first day. It was our first major activity, and things ticked along quite well throughout the entire deploy. These are the final moments of terminal sequence. All the spacecraft is armed, the deployment is armed, and we see a perfectly smooth deployment, stable satellite, all systems just looked perfect, and we were absolutely pleased with what we saw with the West Star deployment.
I don't know who's upside down. It's either me or the photographer. Ron and I were 2 out of 3, so we were probably right side up.
Turns out by this time in a flight, it doesn't matter who's upside down. We just as soon sit on the ceiling to eat lunch as not.
Of course, we know that Ron McNair was part of the Challenger accident, but at that point, he had flown, that was his second flight.